10 prehistoric survival methods that saved humanity from extinction. Number 10. Persistence hunting. The animal is faster. That has always been true and always will be. A kudu can reach 60 kilometers per hour. A gemsbuck can accelerate to speeds that would make a racehorse look cautious. Whatever the prey and whatever the terrain, the prey outpaces the hunter in a straight sprint, every time, by a margin that makes the outcome look predetermined. But that analysis measures the wrong race. Humans cannot sprint like a kudu. What humans can do, and what no other large mammal on Earth can match, is run a kudu into the ground. At midday in the Kalahari, when temperatures climb above 40 degrees Celsius, most hoofed animals face a hard biological limit. They cool by panting, a process mechanically linked to breathing and gait rhythm while running. They cannot pant and run efficiently at the same time without overheating. A human, sweating through approximately 2 to 3 million eccrine glands distributed across the entire body surface, thermoregulates continuously at a full run, for hours. The prey overheats, the human does not. The animal slows and circles. The hunter reads the tracks and follows. In 1984, David Carrier at the University of Utah published a paper in Current Anthropology proposing that this endurance advantage was not incidental. It was, he argued, a core feature of human evolution, that our ancestors ran prey to collapse over distances of 15 to 35 kilometers in the heat of the day, combining stamina with the ability to track an animal across terrain where the footprints became intermittent, predict where it had gone, and close the distance before it recovered. The anatomy reflects this. Human Achilles tendons are disproportionately large. The gluteus maximus, the largest muscle in the body, contributes almost nothing to walking, but is critical for distance running. These anatomical signatures predate any weapon in the archaeological record. In 2006, field researcher Louis Liebenberg published documentation in Current Anthropology of actual persistence hunts observed among the Kalahari San people of southern Africa. Liebenberg recorded hunts covering up to 30 kilometers, executed in the midday heat, in which a single hunter followed a kudu on foot for several hours until the animal could no longer stand. The kill was not a throw. The hunter walked to the animal and dispatched it at arm's length. What elevates this above athletic achievement is the cognitive requirement. Persistence hunting is not chasing, it is forecasting. The hunter must read animal tracks under heat shimmer, understand how a specific species behaves under the particular stress of prolonged flight, predict the animal's likely path based on terrain, wind, and the physiology of an overheating quadruped, and then maintain that prediction across hours of running. In cognitive science terms, this is prospective modeling. Building a mental simulation of events that have not yet happened and acting on it continuously. It is one of the more complex things a brain can do. The debate in paleoanthropology remains active. A minority view questions whether persistence hunting was common enough to constitute a survival strategy, or whether it was supplemented by ambush and scavenging more heavily than the hypothesis allows. What remains undisputed is the anatomy. Human bodies are engineered not for power, but for distance. And the engineering predates every other hunting technology in the fossil record. There is also a social implication built into the method. A hunt of 30 kilometers in 40-degree heat requires caloric preparation, water support, and communal division of the resulting meat. It can only function inside a group willing to invest in the hunter before the hunt and distribute the protein afterward. Persistence hunting was never an individual survival strategy. It was a community bet. But killing the prey was only part of the problem. Returning to a sleep site that did not kill the hunter in the night was another problem entirely. Number 9. Insect-repelling bedding. In December 2011, Lynn Wadley, an honorary professor at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, published findings in Science from a rock shelter called Sibudu in KwaZulu-Natal Province, South Africa. Wadley had been excavating there since 1998. Within a stratum of sediment 3 meters thick, her team found something that archaeologists rarely think to document: beds. Not metaphorical beds, constructed sleeping surfaces. Compressed layers of sedge stems, rushes, and leaves stacked in at least 15 distinct episodes going back 77,000 years. Each layer represented a deliberate act. Someone collecting plant material from the Utongathi River directly below the site, carrying it to the shelter and arranging it on the cave floor. The oldest layer, dated to approximately 77,000 years ago, pushed the record of constructed bedding back by roughly 50,000 years. But the choice of material changed what the discovery meant. The topmost surface of the oldest beds, the layer between the sleeping body and the open air, consisted almost entirely of leaves from Cryptocarya woodii, the river wild quince. These leaves, when crushed, release volatile chemical compounds that are toxic to mosquito larvae and insecticidal to a range of biting and crawling insects. Botanist Marion Bamford, who identified the species, noted that these plants contributed nothing to comfort. The underlying sedge stems provided cushioning. The Cryptocarya leaves were placed deliberately on top. Somebody understood what those leaves did. In August 2020, Wadley and colleagues published a second study in Science, this time from Border Cave in the Lubombo Mountains near the South Africa-Eswatini border. Here they found evidence of grass bedding approximately 200,000 years old. Broadleafed camphor bush, an aerial insect repellent still actively used in rural East Africa today, have been burned and placed as ash beneath the sleeping surface. The researchers concluded that the fine ash physically blocked crawling insects by clogging their breathing structures, a mechanism distinct from the aromatic deterrents at Subudu, but functionally identical in outcome. 200,000 years ago, people were already managing the biological threat inside their sleeping space. This matters for survival in a way the academic literature tends to understate. In sub-Saharan Africa throughout the Pleistocene, the most consistent killer was not predators. It was not starvation, it was vector-borne disease. Malaria, trypanosomiasis, and other parasite-driven illnesses transmitted by insects were present across the entire span of human evolution. And children, the irreplaceable bottleneck of any population's continuity, were the most vulnerable to repeated infection. A community that slept on insect-repelling plants survived childhood illness at a rate a community sleeping on bare ground could not match. The practice also required a form of knowledge that cannot be improvised. Using Cryptocarya woodii means knowing which specific tree among dozens of riverside species produces the right chemical effect, gathering those leaves rather than others, and replacing them regularly. This is systematized environmental knowledge transmitted across generations, maintained by oral tradition, and applied every night without fail for tens of thousands of years. It is applied pharmacology, operating at the scale of a sleeping mat. Christopher Miller, a geoarchaeologist at the University of Tübingen and co-author of the Subudu study, noted that starting around 73,000 years ago, the occupants also began burning their bedding periodically and relaying fresh material, a practice that cleared pest populations and reset the floor before renewed occupation. The ash record shows this was done repeatedly across different episodes of habitation. Calling this pest control is technically accurate. What it prevented was the death of children. But managing what lived in the sleeping space was one layer of protection. Managing what arrived through the entrance from the open landscape required a different kind of answer, something that could reach beyond arm's length. Number 8. Grain processing. The site should not have been here. By the conventions of mid-20th century archaeology, a structured campsite on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, with 6 brush hut dwellings, organized food preparation areas, a human burial, and preserved plant material representing over 140 species, should have appeared around 10,000 years ago, when agriculture began reshaping the Near East. The site was 23,000 years old. Ohalo II. Discovered in 1989 when lake levels dropped and exposed a prehistoric lakeshore approximately 9 kilometers south of Tiberias in Israel, was submerged shortly after its abandonment and remained sealed under fine sediment for millennia. 6 seasons of excavation between 1989 and 2001 recovered over 160,000 plant remains, from wild barley, emmer wheat, and oats to dozens of edible fruits, seeds, and tubers. The food diversity was not incidental, it was structured, and among the structural elements was a grinding stone. In 2004, Dolores Paperno of the Smithsonian Institution and Ehud Weiss, along with colleagues, published findings in Nature from analysis of microscopic starch granules extracted from the grinding surface. The starch patterns prove the stone had been used specifically to process wild wheat, barley, and oats, grinding them from their intact, largely indigestible form into flour. Adjacent to the grinding stone, the spatial distribution of charred grain fragments suggested a baking installation had operated in the same area. Flatbread, or something functionally similar, was being produced at Ohalo II approximately 11,000 years before the Neolithic Revolution. The nutritional logic is straightforward and important. Raw cereal seeds are difficult for human digestive systems to extract energy from efficiently. Much of the starch in unground, uncooked grain passes through the body without full metabolic conversion. Grinding ruptures cell walls and releases starch granules. Heat denatures proteins and initiates gelatinization. The result is a food form that delivers substantially more available energy from the same raw material. At Ohalo II, this was not an experiment. The ground stone shows repeated use across multiple occupation episodes. It was a practice technique, a standing component of a year-round subsistence strategy during the coldest period of the last ice age. The people of Ohalo II were not proto-farmers. They were hunter-gatherers who had developed a sophisticated method for extracting maximum caloric value from a wild landscape that would have fed fewer people without that method. The plant assemblage suggests year-round occupation. Different species mature in different seasons, and all of them are represented. Fish bones, bird bones, and large mammal remains show caloric diversification across the full available food web. When one source failed, others compensated. This concept, caloric resilience through diversified, intensively processed food sources, was not a feature of early modern humans everywhere. Communities that developed it outlasted communities that did not, particularly during the climatic compression of the last glacial maximum, when plant diversity contracted and large mammal populations thinned. Knowing how to make bread from wild seeds, at a time when the landscape offered very little else, kept populations intact that otherwise would have fragmented. The site drowned when water levels rose. The technique did not. From the problem of feeding people during a glacial period, we move to the problem of killing the animals large enough to make the difference when seeds and gathered plants ran short, and doing so safely. Number 7. Hafted weapons. The stone points from Kathu Pan 1 in South Africa are less than 8 centimeters long on average. They are flint pale, triangular, and worn smooth on their surfaces from handling that ceased 500,000 years ago. What is not worn is the pattern of damage along their edges. The fractures there are impact fractures, the specific kind produced when a pointed object traveling at speed strikes a target that resists. In November 2012, Jane Wilkins of the University of Toronto and colleagues Benjamin Chauville, Kyle Brown, and Michael Chazin published a study in Science that confirmed what those fractures implied. To test their interpretation, the team made replicas of the Kathu Pan points and fired them from a calibrated crossbow at the carcass of a springbok. The resulting damage matched the ancient fracture patterns, not broadly, but specifically, diagnostically. The stone points had been used as spear tips, attached to wooden shafts, and driven into large prey animals at velocity. The date? Approximately 500,000 years ago, roughly 200,000 years earlier than the previous best evidence for hafted hunting technology. The physical capability mattered enormously. A stone-tipped spear balanced for throwing extends killing range by 15 to 20 meters, converting a dangerous close-quarters encounter into something approaching a managed strike. Before this technology, bringing down large game required proximity, close enough to be trampled, charged, or gored. The risk to individual hunters was not merely uncomfortable, it was regularly fatal. And the hunters who died in those encounters carried irreplaceable information in their heads: the locations of water sources, seasonal migration routes of prey, the identities of dangerous plants, the geographic layout of an entire territory that had been memorized over years of travel. The death of a knowledge holder was a different kind of loss than the death of an unskilled individual. But the deeper implication of the Kathu Pan evidence is not the range advantage. It is what hafting reveals about the mind that made it. A hafted spear is not one tool. It is at minimum 3. A shaped stone point, a wooden shaft, and a compound adhesive, likely a mixture of plant resin, ochre, and animal fat, heated together and worked into the binding. Experimental replication of Middle Stone Age hafting adhesives requires sourcing materials from different locations, preparing them in a specific sequence, and applying them with enough skill to produce a joint that holds under impact. None of this can be improvised at the kill site. All of it must be planned and prepared in advance for a hunting situation that has not yet occurred. The archaeological dates for hafted technology at Kathu Pan 1 fall within the range associated with Homo heidelbergensis, the last common ancestor of both Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans. Both lineages inherited this technology. Neither one invented it independently. What this means is that the planning capacity required to produce a composite tool was present in the human lineage earlier than either branch diverged, embedded in the cognitive architecture we both carry. The debate around persistence hunting includes the question of whether hafted spears eventually made endurance pursuit largely redundant. The more probable answer is that they supplemented each other, with different methods applied depending on season, terrain, and prey behavior. What remains undisputed is the shift in predator-prey dynamics. Once human hunters could strike from 20 meters with a stone-tipped weapon prepared in advance, the calculus of large-game hunting changed in a direction that favored the smaller, slower, planning animal. From keeping the body armed in warm climates, we turned to keeping it alive in cold ones. Number 6. Tailored clothing. The body louse is not a distinguished parasite. It is small, wingless, and feeds exclusively on human blood while living in the fibers of clothing. For most of human history, it was simply a nuisance. What no one anticipated was that the body louse would turn out to be one of the most precise dating instruments in prehistoric research. Body lice evolved from head lice. The two populations diverged genetically at a specific moment when body lice gained access to a new habitat, clothing. Before clothing, there was no body louse. After clothing, there was one. The two events are the same event. In January 2011, David Reed, Associate Curator of Mammals at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida, published a 5-year DNA sequencing study in Molecular Biology and Evolution. Reed's team used the mutation rate of the louse genome to calculate when body lice first diverged from head lice. The answer was approximately 170,000 years ago, coinciding with the penultimate ice age, roughly 10,000 years before the most intense cold of that glacial period, according to ice core temperature estimates. Modern humans had been losing ancestral body hair for approximately 1 million years before that date. For the preceding 800,000 years, the hominins who became us were effectively hairless in an increasingly variable climate. Then, during a period of extreme cold, they made clothing. And a louse that had previously had nowhere to live except hair moved into woven fiber, started a new lineage, and preserved the date of that transition in its own DNA without intending to. The physical evidence catches up roughly 120,000 years later. In 2016, excavations at Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia recovered a sewing needle made from bird bone, approximately 7 centimeters long, with a drilled eye for thread. The needle was dated to approximately 50,000 years ago. It was not made by modern humans. The sediment layer in which it was found contained Denisovan remains, the residue of an extinct hominin lineage distinct from both Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens. Whatever Denisovans were doing with that needle, it required thread, technique, and a degree of manual precision in drilling an eye through a 7-centimeter bird bone that punctures any assumption about cognitive simplicity in archaic hominin lineages. Then there is Sunghir, Russia, approximately 34,000 years ago. 2 boys, aged roughly 10 and 12, were buried head-to-head in a common grave. Their bodies were covered in ivory beads, more than 10,000 of them, individually drilled and polished, sewn into the garments they wore at burial. Each bead required approximately 1 hour to produce. The community had invested over 10,000 hours of skilled labor in the burial clothing of 2 children. That investment tells us that clothing, by 34,000 years ago, had moved well beyond insulation. It had become a surface for meaning, for ceremony, for the visible expression of social identity. The survival logic remains blunt regardless of the ceremony. Without tailored, fitted, sewn clothing, not draped hides but close-fitting garments designed to trap body heat against the skin and prevent wind from penetrating, Migration above the 40th parallel latitude was physiologically impossible. The human body loses heat exponentially faster through exposed skin and loosely wrapped fabric than through a properly fitted garment sealed at the wrists, ankles, and neck. Tailored clothing effectively expanded the habitable range of the species by tens of millions of square kilometers. It opened Europe, Central Asia, and Siberia to human occupation. Without it, the populations who would eventually cross Beringia and reach the Americas could not have been in position to make the crossing. A 7-centimeter bird bone with a drilled hole. 170,000-year record. The margin between one continent and 7, threaded through a needle. But clothing kept the body warm. Medicine kept the body functioning when warmth was not the problem. Number 5. Medicinal plant knowledge. In July 2012, Karen Hardy, a research professor at the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, published a study in the journal Naturwissenschaften that changed the terms of a long-standing debate about Neanderthal cognition. Hardy and colleagues, including archaeologist Stephen Buckley from the University of York, analyzed calcified dental plaque, dental calculus, from the teeth of 5 Neanderthal individuals excavated at El Cedrón Cave in the Asturias region of northern Spain. These individuals had been dead for between 47,000 and 50,000 years. Their calculus had preserved a chemical record of everything they had eaten and inhaled throughout their adult lives. The calculus contained expected compounds, campfire smoke, cooked plant starches. One individual, designated Adult 4, carried something that required a different explanation. Azulines and coumarins, chemical signatures produced by yarrow and chamomile. Neither plant provides meaningful nutritional content. Yarrow has documented anti-inflammatory and anti-parasitic properties. Chamomile has antispasmodic effects. Both are bitter. Both have been used in traditional medicine across multiple cultures for thousands of years. There is no dietary reason to eat them. There is a medical reason, and in this case, it is the only interpretation that fits. In 2017, Laura Wayrick of the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA at the University of Adelaide led a second team that applied ancient DNA sequencing to Neanderthal dental calculus from El Cedrón and from Spy Cave in Belgium, publishing the results in Nature. The El Cedrón calculus carried poplar bark among its contents. Poplar bark contains salicin, the metabolic precursor to salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. The same calculus sample also contained traces of penicillium mold, the original biological source of penicillin. Whether the penicillium was ingested intentionally or incidentally remains a genuine open question. What is not open is the context. A Neanderthal individual showing signs of a likely dental or systemic infection was consuming natural anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial compounds at a moment roughly 60,000 years before anyone formulated the germ theory of disease. The survival arithmetic is direct. Before effective medical knowledge, infections that modern humans resolve with a few days of medication were potentially fatal within days. Dental abscesses, wound infections, intestinal parasites, inflammatory conditions. Any of these could progress to systemic illness rapidly without intervention. A community that maintained even a rudimentary pharmacopoeia, a transmitted knowledge of which plants addressed which physical symptoms, survived illnesses at a rate that communities without such knowledge did not. The mainstream view accepts the dental calculus evidence as genuine, but debates whether Neanderthal medicinal use was systematic or opportunistic. A minority position argues the plant residues reflect non-deliberate ingestion. What remains undisputed is the chemical presence of non-nutritive, medicinally active plant compounds in the calculus of a likely ill individual, an alignment of circumstances that does not resolve to coincidence easily. The uncomfortable implication is also the honest one. Neanderthals had this knowledge, and they still disappeared. Medicinal knowledge was one layer of protection. Survival required layers. And one of the most critical layers addressed a threat that pharmacology alone could not solve: the problem of staying warm and structurally sheltered on an open, treeless plain in the middle of an ice age. Number 4. Cold climate shelter. Picture a January in what is now central Ukraine, approximately 18,000 years ago. There are no trees. The nearest forest is several hundred kilometers to the south. Temperatures after dark drop below -30 degrees Celsius. Wind crosses the open tundra, carrying abrasive silt that has traveled south from active glaciers. Nothing on the horizon, no boulder, no ridge, no stand of timber, interrupts the wind or breaks the cold. And yet, people lived here. Not briefly, not as passing migrants pausing for a season. They lived here for generations, in structures they built themselves, from the only substantial material the landscape made available.
In 1965, a farmer near the village of Mezhyrich in Cherkasy Oblast, central Ukraine, was expanding his cellar when his shovel struck something large. Further digging produced mammoth jawbones, multiple of them, arranged in a pattern that water or soil movement does not produce. Professional excavation between 1966 and 1974 revealed 4 circular structures built entirely from mammoth bones. 149 bones in total, jawbones stacked in low interlocking walls, femurs and tibias arranged as structural verticals, long curved tusks arching overhead to support what would have been a heavy hide roof. In November 2024, Universität Leiden archaeologist Wei Chu and colleagues published a revised radiocarbon chronology of the Mezhyrich structures in Open Research Europe. The largest building dated to approximately 18,300 years ago, during the terminal phase of the last glacial maximum.
Analysis of small mammal remains from the same archaeological layers suggested that at least one of the 4 structures was occupied for up to 429 years across multiple habitation episodes. Not built and abandoned, built and maintained. Individual mammoth bones weigh between 50 and over 200 kilograms. Moving them, orienting them precisely in a circular layout, and fitting jawbones together in interlocking courses required physical coordination across multiple individuals working toward a shared architectural plan. Someone designed this before the first bone was moved. The construction sequence suggests pre-planned execution, not improvisation, and the layout, circular with a central hearth indicated by ash deposits in each structure, was consistent enough across all 4 buildings to reflect a transmitted design, a standard solution to a known problem, reproduced from memory. The engineering was sound. Mammoth bone resists compression far better than any available alternative on the treeless steppe. A jawbone wall blocks wind. A hide stretched over a bone frame with a carefully maintained fire inside creates a survivable thermal environment at temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The structures at Mezhyrich were not shelters of desperation. They were a refined technical solution to one of the most extreme cold environments ever inhabited by our species. The 4 structures may have housed between 20 and 40 individuals. That is a community, not a family. Surviving a Ukrainian winter at the peak of the last ice age inside buildings they had constructed from the remains of the largest land animals in their world, using no material the surrounding landscape refused to provide. From the problem of surviving where you already are, the argument moves to the prior problem, surviving long enough to be there in the first place. Number 3. The coastal lifeline. Ice cores know what the climate was doing. Drilled from the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, these cylinders of compressed ancient snow carry a chemical record of global temperature going back hundreds of thousands of years. Oxygen isotope ratios encode temperature precisely. The cores describe what paleoclimatologists call marine isotope stage 6, a period between approximately 190,000 and 130,000 years ago, as the most severe glacial interval of the late Pleistocene before the last glacial maximum. Temperatures across large parts of interior Africa were lower and drier than at virtually any other point in the last 500,000 years. Freshwater sources were contracting. Grasslands were retreating into fragments. The food webs that supported large mammal populations were breaking apart.
For the population of anatomically modern humans alive during this period, a population that genetic bottleneck analysis suggests was dramatically reduced in size, the question was not where to move next, it was whether any viable population would remain. In October 2007, paleoanthropologist Curtis Marine of the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University published findings in Nature from a cluster of sea cliff caves at Pinnacle Point, South Africa, near the town of Mossel Bay on the Indian Ocean. Systematic excavation beginning in 2000 had recovered shellfish remains, mussels, periwinkles, barnacles, from sediment layers dated to approximately 164,000 years ago. The previous evidence for systematic marine resource use dated to roughly 125,000 years ago. The Pinnacle Point material pushed the record back by 40,000 years. This was not a meal.
It was a subsistence strategy adapted to a specific crisis. During marine isotope stage 6, sea levels sat significantly lower than today, exposing broad continental shelves of intertidal and subtidal platform along the southern African coast. These platforms were reliably productive in a way the interior was not. Shellfish reproduced on their own schedule, regardless of rainfall patterns, droughts, or the contraction of grasslands. The coast did not fail the way the interior did. It absorbed the climate stress and kept producing. The people at Pinnacle Point were not only eating shellfish. The same sediment layers contained ochre processed for red pigment, physical evidence of symbolic behavior. They contained bladelet tools, precisely knapped, small stone blades requiring controlled technique at the upper margin of Middle Stone Age technology.
They were operating with a cognitive and technological sophistication that was not supposed to be present at this date by the earlier timelines. The truly striking aspect is the demographic context. Genetic estimates of human population size during marine isotope stage 6 suggest surviving numbers that may have been in the low thousands, perhaps far fewer. The people using those caves at Pinnacle Point may have been among the last viable modern human populations anywhere on the continent. Not just the last on that shoreline, potentially among the last anywhere. The sea maintained them. The reliable caloric floor provided by tidal resources allowed populations to stabilize during a period when the interior could not support them.
The technical sophistication developing in coastal communities during this period, refined stone tools, organized foraging, symbolic communication through ochre, accumulated into the behavioral toolkit that would eventually power the expansion out of Africa and across the globe. The most significant migration in human history did not happen because people were bold. It happened because coastal communities had developed the cognitive and social infrastructure to sustain it. And that infrastructure depended on something that the genetics eventually made impossible to ignore. Number 2, the social network. In 1955, construction workers near Vladimir, Russia, approximately 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow, uncovered a human skeleton. The site, called Sunghir, was excavated from 1957 through the 1970s.
Among the burials recovered from sediment dated to approximately 34,000 years ago was a shared grave. 2 boys, aged roughly 10 and 12 years old, placed in a shallow pit head to head. The labor inventory inside that grave is unlike anything recovered from the same period in Europe. More than 10,000 ivory beads, individually drilled and polished, were sewn onto the boys' clothing and headdresses. At an estimated production rate of approximately 1 bead per hour, the community had invested over 10,000 hours of skilled manual work in the burial adornment of 2 children. 16 mammoth ivory spears accompanied them, not shaped from tusk sections but made by straightening mammoth ivory through controlled heating and sustained mechanical force, a technique requiring significant expertise. Pierced fox canines, ivory discs, and carved animal figures completed the assemblage. None of this can be explained by individual self-interest.
Every object in that grave required community labor. In 2017, Martin Sikora and colleagues at the Natural History Museum of Denmark, together with Marta Mirazón-Lar of the University of Cambridge, published the full genome sequences of 4 Sunghir individuals in Science. The genetic results found no close biological kinship among any of them. Not parent and child, not siblings, not first cousins, not second cousins. The 4 individuals clustered as members of the same broadly shared regional population, estimated by the study at between 160 and 900 procreating adults in total. But they were genetically unrelated to each other at any degree that would activate kin selection under conventional evolutionary models. They were, in the genomic record, deliberate community. Strangers who had chosen to live together, invest in each other, and bury their dead with 10,000 hours of collective grief. The structural implication for survival is clear and significant. A human group built only from biological family is limited by family size, vulnerable to disease removing key knowledge holders, and unable to absorb the loss of any member whose skills no one else replicates. A social network that deliberately recruits unrelated individuals on the basis of shared norms, complementary skills, or territorial alliance can absorb losses, redistribute expertise, and maintain population viability through the kinds of disruptions that would collapse a purely kinship-based group. Research on the Hadza people of Tanzania, published in Nature in 2012 by Clea Apicella and colleagues at Harvard University, found that cooperation among Hadza adults extended systematically beyond biological kin, structured around shared norms rather than genetic relationship.
The Sunghir genetic evidence suggests this social architecture was already operating at least 34,000 years ago, and possibly far earlier, given how fully elaborated it appears in that burial. You exist in part because people who had every genetic reason to save resources for their own children chose instead to invest in a community of strangers. Consider what the skeleton of the disabled child at Sunghir tells us about that investment. He was fed when he could not hunt. He was cared for when he could not contribute. He received the most labor-intensive burial at the site. At a moment in human prehistory when survival was genuinely marginal, when winters were severe, food was seasonal, and populations were small enough that every individual loss mattered, a community was spending time it could not afford on a child who offered no immediate caloric return. That is not mere social behavior.
That is the organizational logic of civilization. 34,000 years before anyone built a city. All of it rested on something older than social networks, older than sewing needles, older than hafted spears or grain processing or insect-repelling bedding. It rested on a discovery so fundamental that every other survival method in this video is downstream of it. Something that reorganized not just behavior, but the biochemistry of the human body itself. Number 1. Controlled fire. Picture yourself inside a cave in what is now the northern Cape of South Africa, 1 million years ago. The cave runs 140 meters into the hillside. The air inside is cooler than the Kalahari outside. Midday heat above 40 degrees. But something is different from every other shadow in every other rock on the entire landscape. A small concentrated point of light and warmth near the interior floor that does not move, does not recede with the approaching body, does not belong to anything alive. It was brought here. It was maintained. In April 2012, Francesco Berna and Paul Goldberg of Boston University, together with Michael Chazin of the University of Toronto and international colleagues, published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from Wonderwerk Cave in the Northern Cape. Using Fourier transform infrared microspectroscopy, a technique that identifies the molecular signatures of heat-altered materials in microscopic sediment samples, they analyzed intact sediment layers from the cave floor. What they found was microscopic plant ash and fragments of charred bone. The ash had not been blown in by wind. The charred bone showed no signs of water transport. The burning had happened in place, in the same sediment layer as stone tools of the early Acheulean tradition, during occupation associated with Homo erectus. The date was approximately 1 million years ago, pushing the confirmed record of controlled fire use back by roughly 300,000 years from the previous consensus. Start with the body and work outward, because the consequences of this discovery branch in every direction simultaneously. Richard Wrangham of Harvard University has argued since the late 1990s, in a hypothesis now broadly accepted within paleoanthropology, that cooking was the metabolic catalyst for the most dramatic transformation in hominin biology. Cooking functions as external digestion. It breaks down cell walls, denatures proteins, initiates starch gelatinization, and delivers substantially more available calories from the same raw material than uncooked food provides. A smaller gut requires less energy to maintain. The energy freed from digestive work went, over hundreds of thousands of years, into cranial tissue. The brain that would eventually invent every other survival method examined in this video was, in a direct metabolic sense, built by fire. The transition from Homo erectus to anatomically modern humans includes a reduction in gut size, a reduction in jaw and tooth size, and an increase in brain volume that correlates precisely with the timeline of regular cooking. Not because fire was the only factor, but because no other single variable in the available record explains the simultaneous transformation of so many body systems. Consider the night separately from the body. Before controlled fire, darkness was a predator corridor. Cave lions, leopards, and spotted hyenas were most active after sunset. Shelters provided structural protection. Fire provided a perimeter. No ethnographic record documents large predators entering a maintained campfire circle.
For a primate that had lost most of its body hair, that had no venom or armored surface, and whose infants were helpless for 2 to 3 years after birth, a reliable nighttime perimeter reduced predation mortality in ways that cannot be overstated. It also extended the functional day. Tool repair, teaching, social organization, and oral transmission of knowledge could now happen after dark, in the warmth of a fixed point of light. And here is where the fire becomes something beyond a tool. The hearth reorganized human social space. A fire is a fixed social point that draws individuals together, faces them toward a common center, and extends the period of social contact into the night. The knowledge transmitted around prehistoric fires, routes, risks, techniques, histories, seasonal patterns, the identities of dangerous plants and reliable water sources, was not archived in any physical form. It was archived in the people who heard it, in the traditions those people maintained, and in the populations those traditions allowed to survive the next winter. The grain grinding at Ohalo II happened around a fire. The insect-repelling bedding was maintained by fire. The mammoth-bone huts at Sunghir had central hearths as their structural logic. The medicinal plants that Neanderthals consumed were sometimes prepared with heat. The social gatherings from which the cooperation at Sunghir was organized took place around fires that illuminated the same shared space. Wonderwerk Cave, whose name in Afrikaans translates as miracle, was named before anyone understood what was inside it, before the ash analysis, before the infrared spectroscopy,
before anyone knew that the sediment underfoot contained evidence of a behavior that rebuilt human biology, eliminated the predator advantage after dark, and gave communities a fixed point around which knowledge could be organized, transmitted, and preserved across generations. The name was chosen for the landscape. It turned out to fit the evidence. Fire did not just solve individual problems. It changed what a human group was capable of being, what it could eat, where it was safe to sleep, how much of what one person knew could transfer to someone else, how far into a cold landscape a community could move and survive. Every boundary that separated early humans from extinction was pushed outward by fire, and every other method on this list was built, maintained, or made possible by what fire made possible first. The true survival method was never any single tool or technique.
It was the capacity to learn, remember, transmit, and apply. The capacity that fire, over 1 million years, fed into existence. Across the 10 methods examined here, a pattern emerges that the individual entries can only suggest. Persistence hunting required social investment before and after the kill. Insect-repelling bedding required transmitted botanical knowledge. Grain processing required a refined technique passed from person to person across generations. Hafted weapons required planning, multi-material preparation, and shared foraging routes worth protecting. Tailored clothing required the transfer of sewing technique across decades. Medicinal knowledge required a pharmacopoeia maintained through oral tradition. Cold climate shelter required coordinated engineering effort and reproducible design. The coastal lifeline required communities stable enough to develop diversified subsistence strategies. Social networks deliberately extended beyond kin required norms enforced by group memory and group will. Fire required maintenance, skill, and transmission. Every one of these methods depended on the others. None of them worked in isolation. The modern inheritance of these methods is not archaeological. Artemisinin, derived from the same plant medicine traditions that run through the dental calculus of L. cedron Neanderthals, remains one of the most effective antimalarial compounds in clinical use today. Aspirin, acetyl-salicylic acid, synthesized from the salicylic acid pathway present in poplar bark, is taken by hundreds of millions of people daily.
Marine omega-3 fatty acids, which sustained the Pinnacle Point populations during marine isotope stage 6, are now identified as essential for fetal brain development. A modeling study published in PLOS One in May 2023 by researchers Francisco Plana, Jorge Perez, and Andres Abeliuk at the Universidad de Chile found that food-sharing networks structured around non-kin cooperation were dramatically more resilient against individual and group starvation events than networks organized around kinship alone. Running on the same organizational logic the Sunghir DNA revealed 34,000 years ago. The pattern visible across all 10 entries is that survival never depended on a single capability. It depended on redundancy, overlapping solutions to overlapping threats, each independently capable of preventing death, but collectively capable of sustaining a population through disasters that no single method could have absorbed alone. There is a version of human history in which one of these methods was not developed, or was lost, or failed to transmit across a critical bottleneck. The genetic record suggests that version nearly happened. Human populations passed through constrictions tight enough that the effective breeding population of the entire species was, at certain moments, smaller than a medium-sized city. The thread held. But it held narrowly, and the holding was not passive. It required people to learn what plants to burn under a sleeping mat, what tree bark to chew when the body failed, how to strike a fire into bone and hold it through the night. History is not the record of inevitable progress. It is the accumulated record of marginal survival, of solutions barely adequate to the crises that provoked them. The methods were imperfect, the margins were narrow.
And everything that followed, every generation born since, every culture that grew from them, descended from communities that held those margins barely by knowing what seeds to grind, what bones to stack, where the sea met the shore when the world was at its coldest, and whose fire to sit beside when the night came down. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.